In the meantime, I'm really pleased to be able to welcome our guests today. Here in DC, we have Allison Weiner, Director of USAID's Center for Education within what's now the agency's Bureau for Inclusive Growth, Partnerships, and Innovation. Sitting at USAID, Allison obviously has an important vantage point for contributing to this discussion, but she also has decades of experience working in education and education policy. And online, we have Ben Piper, who leads the global education program at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. There he is. And in addition, prior to joining the foundation, Ben had direct involvement in some of these USAID investments, including Primer and Chisome in Kenya, while working for implementing partner RTI. So with that, I'll turn it over to Justin.
Great. Can everybody hear me okay? Why I ask that, because it's hard for you to give me feedback. We're going to assume that you can. Thanks, as Aaron said, thanks everybody in DC for making it out on Monday of Thanksgiving week, and good to have everybody online as well. So this is actually an incredibly intimidating presentation in that, looking at the list of people online and knowing the people in the room, I'm fairly confident, despite the fact that I'm going to be talking for the next 20 minutes, that I know the least about this topic of anybody involved. And so my role here is just to sort of serve as rapporteur about data that some of you collected on programs that some of you ran, and put some numbers on the table. And then, Allison and Ben and others are going to, give their reactions, and we'll take it from there. So this is effectively a meta-analysis of the early grade reading evaluation portfolio, together with Tomas at MSI and Xiaomin and T, who work with me and our education team here at CGD. I think I'm excited about this, and I reached out to Elena to start talking about this several months ago because, for two reasons, basically. One, the early grade reading portfolio, I think, is the biggest, kind of most serious, sustained effort in the development space to improve learning outcomes. This is, and we went and talked about FCDO about this today, and they're like, yes, you guys are the model that we look at to learn about how to do this stuff. So this is the world's biggest, most serious effort to do this well, I think. And second, because, and most exciting for me as an empirical researcher, that there has been this commitment to rigorous and transparent evaluation for so many years and systematically across the portfolio. And that's just sort of unparalleled and unheard of. We have, in the economics world, we got all excited when we got 6 RCTs on microfinance, and the Nobel Prize winners made a big splash off of that. And that was unprecedented to have 6 evaluations of not really quite the same thing, but sort of the same. And here we've got a dozen RCTs and dozens of other rigorous evaluations. And so this is an amazing kind of evidence portfolio here, and lots I think we can learn from. So this is building very directly on the 10-year kind of retrospective that USAID put out quite recently. And that was, as I already said, this all began with me reading that and wanting to blog about it. And as I started writing up a blog, I started to have questions, and I started wanting to go further and deeper, and started talking to Elena and to Amy and Tomas and others, and here we are. But I just want to give full credit to, none of this would have happened without that 10-year retrospective already being there. Okay, so the outline of what I want to say, 4 points basically. Talk a little bit about the early grade reading model. I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know, but it's important to say what we are and aren't evaluating in this meta-analysis. Talk about the portfolio, which is really what is the data that I'm going to be analyzing, and then jump straight into, I think there's all kinds of reasons, and we'll talk about those, that averages can be misleading, and we want to talk about is the variance. The nuance part of my role here is to be like, okay, yes, but this is the average effect, and let's talk about it. And then to talk a bit as well about the cost effectiveness numbers and the cost data. So on the model, what is and is not really being evaluated here, I think for this crowd, this goes sort of without saying, but, and we're online, so let's make sure I say it out loud. You can think of programs as having sort of 3 tiers, or you could draw more tiers if you wanted to. But at the top, I'm just going to say phonics for shorthand, by which I mean, using synthetic phonics, focusing on phonemic awareness, doing, guided oral reading, all the kind of pedagogical content that you're trying to convey and get teachers to adopt is what these programs are trying to impart. there are methods that all of you have developed and are very familiar with about how we go about doing that. If you're comfortable with the structured pedagogy label or not, and I'm going to use it in and out here. And then beneath that, though, how does USAID promote these things? Well, it's through awards, contracts, and grants to organizations represented around the table. So again, hopefully needless to say, but if in a given program we come back with a null result, I hope that doesn't, whoops, going backwards, that should not shake your faith in phonics, right? There's other links in the causal chain here. And what we're learning about today, if we're learning anything, I think, is not, does phonics work? That's set up by a much larger body of evidence under more controlled conditions. We're maybe learning something about, I think this is one of the most systematic efforts to look at the effect of structured pedagogy on average and over multiple attempts to make this work. And we're ultimately evaluating a USAID foreign aid portfolio for early grade reading programs. Okay. The structured pedagogy components, we took, from this Graham and Kelly review, which scored a bunch of different programs, and we just added more and kind of went through your reports and tried to mark them down. Is there training of teachers with an evidence-based curriculum, provision of instructional materials, follow-up coaching? For this audience, I don't think I need to go through this so much, but to give people a flavor of what the programs are doing, there's both commonalities here. Many elements are common, but there is variance. It's not, I don't want to pretend that, all of these programs are identical, even at the broad brushstrokes of what the core program elements are. There is variation, and of course, in the last column, there is variation on whether there is a focus on mother tongue instruction. People are looking at specific programs and querying I would be very receptive, and possibly afterwards too. That's not, most of these we didn't code, but we'd be very receptive to if things should be scored. But scored's not the right word, but categorized differently. Okay, but then talking about a little bit about the bottom piece, which is ultimately what, as an economist, I would say we're evaluating here is a channel of foreign aid, right? Is a way for the US government to provide foreign assistance to Kenya or Liberia or Malawi through this conduit. And, this model of American foreign aid, American companies delivering aid, is really common, not just in education, but in other sectors, right? It constitutes about a third of the US foreign assistance budget. This is some work we had done on a piece on localization last year, or earlier this year. And so money going, of USAID's budget going to American NGOs and companies is about a third of the total. And of course, much larger than the amount going to, local NGOs and companies, but there's other pieces that go through multilaterals and so on. But this is sort of the kind of modal form of US foreign assistance. And so I think it's important also to look at how this way of delivering aid works. All right, on to the evaluation portfolio. What is so amazing about USAID's evaluation portfolio, in early grade reading in particular? One, this concept of mandatory evaluations, I think is actually a very different paradigm about how we do evaluation than we often use in other institutions, maybe at the World Bank, I'll pick on people, or elsewhere, which is to say, hey, we've got one pilot or exemplary program, let's evaluate that and see if we think this methodology works. It does or it doesn't. If it does, maybe we can go forward with it. The approach here is to say, let's keep evaluating, let's keep learning. All the programs need evaluations, which I think provides an amazing opportunity, both to get to the right answer, but also for the evaluation results to kind of feed into that policy development. As an education person, I constantly bemoan the fact that you really can't, in most of the literature, compare outcomes. A standard deviation is not the same thing in Liberia and Kenya, and it's just not meaningful. Earlier in my career, I was trying to publish papers and had effects that were 0.2 standard deviations. And people would say, well, is that bigger or smaller than Esther Duflo's paper that got 0.3 standard deviations? Like, well, it's a different country and a different test. So it doesn't, there's just no way to make that comparison. Obviously, enormous effort here on the early grade reading assessment as a tool. We'll talk about, still limits to comparability there, but at least, this effort to have this harmonized outcome is a unique advantage in this setting. I think we should take advantage of. And then for all the pros and cons of USAID relying almost entirely on external implementing partners to run these programs, one big advantage analytically is that all your budgets are common knowledge, right? We know how much money went in to a given implementing partner to run this program, and so we can see the top line dollar numbers. We can see the bottom line learning results, and we can see the top line cost numbers, and so we have a really transparent lens on value for money there. Okay, the portfolio. We're talking today about around 50 programs spanning 30 countries, 70 million kids. This is basically the set of evaluations that was in the 10-year retrospective, adding in a few more that come along the pipeline since, color-coded by where a color got green if there was at least one RCT in the country, yellow if there was a difference in differences, if there was a different evaluation in the country, and red there just had before and after evaluations of programs in that country. So, obviously clearly very Africa focused, but not exclusively. Specifically, the portfolio of evaluations we're going to look at today are 49 evaluations. We start off, the ones that we are aware of flagship EGR programs were 49 evaluations. 40 of those we have access to micro data. Another 3, there are still working, waiting, trying. But another 3 with sufficiently comparable published statistics, though, that we felt comfortable bringing them into some of the meta-analysis. Otherwise, everything I'm going to show you here is, us, our state of code, back to the microdata, our specification. Talk more about that in a minute. But for those 3, that's going off to published statistics. And then there are 6 that we couldn't get access to data. We couldn't find the results that we wanted in the report. So 6 don't make it in. Of those 43 that make it in, there are 12 randomized trials, 15 different diff evaluations, and then another 16 that just have before and after EGRA results. So I'm going to start by talking about just the RCTs and the diff and diff evaluations, just the evaluations that have kind of a credible control group, and where I'm comfortable talking about the results in terms of a treatment effect, a putatively causal impact of this program on literacy. Again, it's going to be mostly first and second grade. I don't have the histogram in front of me, but first, second, as you all know better than me, some third, all the way up to programs in 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. Okay, let's dive straight in to the treatment effects. The average impact of USAID early grade reading programs on oral reading fluency. And we're going to focus really on correct words per minute throughout as kind of a singular top line metric of outcomes. We'll do a little bit on letters and letter sounds just to check that that's not leading us astray. So the experimental design, original evaluations, the treatment varies at the school level in most of these data sets, sometimes higher at a cluster or zone or even district level. So that's all kind of taken into account in the statistics, but important to keep that in mind in the analysis. This is all kind of intention to treat analysis of this program. This school was assigned to the program, and so if you're in that school, you're considered, and you're in that grade, you're considered treated. Mostly not pupil panels. There are, a handful of pupil panel data sets here. We actually don't think have access to any of the pupil panels. So this is all being treated as repeated cross-section, baseline, and follow-up analysis. The reanalysis we did, some of these have multiple rounds of data, multiple midlines. Some of them have multiple treatment arms. We are focusing exclusively here on the baseline and end line rounds. And we're focusing exclusively on the purest control group and the strongest full treatment group. Not that those other intermediate things, there's lots to learn sometimes from how did individual program components compare, but for today, it's the kind of most vanilla evaluation we can get. Baseline, end line, full treatment, full control, with controls for age, grade, and sex. Basically, that's it. And we, that's all we have. We can kind of get across these evaluations. Simple, different diff specification there, except a few of the RCTs that only have a cross section. Okay, getting right to it. Treatment effects. I think the first thing to take away, which you all know, but is is really important to stress, there is amazing variance in the outcomes of these programs, right? You just get very different results. And those range from, almost just about significantly negative results there in the DRC program, the diff and diff evaluation there in the DRC, up to, some of the star results that many of us know well, including, primary in Kenya and the recent Liberia Read program, posting, gains in the 10 to 15 correct words per minute range. That variance, I think it's important to stress, is not just like, if you ran 30 some evaluations, you're going to get some variance. This exceeds statistical noise. There's genuine variance here, more than could be produced by chance. There really is. I don't think that's shocking to anybody who's done development. Contexts differ, and we already saw that the programs differ somewhat, but these results are different across programs. The paper, by the way, is now online. So if you're squinting there to look at, who is what and what is what. Now, this is a good place for me to pause and say, we've gone back to make sure this is all harmonized as much as we can and reanalyzed microdata sets from all of these evaluations. We have really, maybe this is boring to say, we have really no news to share about, we did a reanalysis and guess what? The Tusome results are wrong. No, that's not what in none of these cases have we found like major discrepancies from original evaluation reports. I mean, and where there are some discrepancies, it's fairly uninteresting ones around nulls. But in no case are we saying like, there was this previous claim of a big significant result and we can't reproduce that. This is about aggregating and looking at the overall portfolio. There's no gotcha here in terms of finding big mistakes in the evaluation portfolio. So the programs you expect that did well, did indeed do well as far as we can tell. Averaging though, so putting everything into this kind of meta-analytic model, random effects model, getting our overall estimate, we find an average treatment effect across all programs of just under 3 correct words per minute in the RCTs and just under 3 correct words per minute in the diff and diff studies. If you prefer to talk about correct letters and letter sounds, we're making the little leap here of pooling letters and letter sounds. That's more like between 6 and 7. One of the points that multiple people, including, I'm sure, Ben may raise this, Ben, but he was not the only one. At least 3 people, objected to that. Wow, you're comparing correct words per minute in many different languages. So obviously, it's better than a lot of what we do in terms of comparing effect sizes, but it's still very far from perfect. The reason we brought in the correct letter sounds per minute was to say, okay, let's look at something which is a little bit less sensitive to word length. And I put the scatter plot in? No, I didn't. In any case, we get an experiment rank correlation of about 0.7 across programs. So it's not perfect, but there is a strong, significant correlation between the gains you're getting in correct words per minute, which is a bit sensitive to word length, and the gains you're getting in correct letter sounds, which should be less sensitive to word length. Okay, that was just about the RCTs and the diff and diffs. What can we say about the before and after evaluations? Here we're just going to report results using the treatment group only, because for the before and after, all we have is a treatment group, right? So let's hold the RCTs and the diff and diffs to that same thing and only use the treatment group. How much did learning improve in the same grade? How much did oral reading fluency rather improve in the same grade within the treatment group only? And you can look at the individual results there. And I think the one slightly daunting thing, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news here, but if we're worried about the external validity of the rigorous evaluations, what we see here is actually the learning progress in the treatment groups was slower in those other before and after studies. So if anything, I think we should probably these studies that ended up getting more rigorous evaluations had faster learning gains. And it's optimistic to say that they have external validity to the other contexts that only had before and after evaluations. So a little bit slower learning progress in the studies that didn't have a control group. Turning to the costs, that's the last of the 4 points, and which takes us into scalability and improvement over time. Program costs are high by local standards. That's a subjective statement, but let's talk numbers here, but fall quite dramatically with the scale of the program. So on the average program, I hope this is clear. There's a very crucial distinction here. The average program costs about $200 per child. And that's, if you look at per pupil government expenditure, that's about equivalent to doubling school spending in the countries where USAID is working, the equivalent of doubling school spending. So the programs on average, and that's, I think, weighted the same way that the treatment effects are weighted. So sort of apples and apples. So the treatment effect is 3 words a minute, the cost was $200. But if you weight it differently by the total kids in the program, that goes way down to about $34. And the obvious resolution of that paradox is just because the bigger programs spend a lot less per child. And that's what that graph shows, rapidly declining costs with scale. Now, the question then becomes, for scalability, is do the effects persist when you go to scale? The results are pretty ambiguous there. There is a downward slope there. That relationship is not statistically significant. So I kind of make of that what you will. And I think it's a little bit of cause for concern there about the ability to produce, similar or bigger, you would hope, effects at large scale. But there's no significant relationship to report here. Lastly, last empirical result before I turn over to Allison and Ben. And this figured prominently in the 10-year retrospective report as well. If kids are learning a little, at least in these programs, it seems that so is USAID. I think one of the hypotheses it came to this work with was that this idea of evaluating everything and continuing to iterate on the model ought to lead to continued improvement over time, right? We would hope to see those treatment effects growing, across programs as the lessons from past programs are built into program design. There is some statistically significant evidence of that. Whether we're satisfied with the slope of that line is, a question for debate. But we do see larger impacts in later years, newer programs with, not getting up super high, but later programs generating somewhat larger results. All right, so to conclude and recap, impacts vary widely, some remarkable successes, lots of nulls, modest on average. I think if we're, it's subjective characterization, but I think we all hope for bigger gains across the portfolio than 3 correct words per minute. Cost and scale, costs are high by local standards, but fall rapidly when these programs go big. So the question is, can we keep those impacts robust? Mandatory evaluations are the way and offer the chance for real learning and improvement. And it has worked out that way in this portfolio. I think that the big question that's looming on the horizon, and I know Allison will pick up on this, is Administrator Power's localization agenda. What is this right now? These are kind of led by implementing partners, and when the program closes, you got to ask real questions about how much of this stuff is going to continue to be implemented in the schools afterward. And so, can the localization agenda speak to the sustainability of these gains? All right, thank you very much. Let me stop there.
Great, thanks, Justin. So I think we'll go ahead and turn it over to Allison first, and then I'm happy to go to Ben. And Allison, happy to have your reactions on sort of any of what Justin provided. One thing I maybe will put on the list of things for you to maybe think about or respond to is, that penultimate slide where we saw the sort of data of some significant improvement, if sort of modest, over time. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of what the agency's approach has been when it comes to learning from these evaluations? And again, kudos for having this incredible body of evaluations, but sort of, in what ways are you thinking about how to use these results to inform future programming?
Great, thank you so much. Okay, well, good morning to everybody in the room and also online. Thanks, Justin and CGD for the team for hosting us today. I'm really grateful for the work that's gone into this paper, and I'm eager to jump into today's discussion. So as Justin mentioned, my name's Allison Weiner. I'm currently the director of USAID's Center for Education. I am a USAID Foreign Service Officer. I've just come back from 17 years implementing these types of programs overseas with many of you in this room and many of you online. So first of all, thank you for that, and thank you for that work. And together we are able to provide you with the fun evidence you need to look at and have us all here today. But in all seriousness, it's super important that we have these discussions. It makes me really excited and happy that there's interest number one, and also a decade plus worth of data that we can dig into. So it's a very exciting time. So I think if we're looking back at the 2011 to 2018 education strategy of USAID, we know it played a pivotal role in establishing a global focus on reading skills, on education quality, and the need to ensure that all children and youth not only attend, but learn while in school. This is a big shift. This policy brought about accountability towards learning outcomes, as opposed to accountability towards, overall development goals. This is really the first time, I think, as an education sector, we committed as an agency to these goals of improving learning outcomes and measuring them and being transparent about it. A huge leap for our agency. But none of this work would have ever happened without the partnership of our partner governments. And I think that didn't come out so much in the study because you're actually looking at results, but the partnerships that we have, I mean, the implementing partners, the American companies that partner with local organizations, could have never achieved any of this without the civil service of the partner countries that we work in, the teachers, the researchers, all of the local knowledge and skills that exist in country, the curriculum writers. I mean, Ben can go into this, but Ben and I have been in rooms with hundreds of people working on this for many, many years. It is hard work, but I think the input of USAID being so critical, the funding that we provide and the technical assistance we provide with our implementing partners is just a spark. Ultimately, it's a spark that gets things going. And we'll talk more about how that works. I have to say, the EGRA was revolutionary for USAID. Introducing that methodology to ourselves, first of all, and our partner governments was extremely important. And most of our partner governments would tell us that this is not an issue. Our curriculum covers this, we're producing readers. The EGRA brought this in front of our eyes, right? You're sitting across the table from a child. You can't argue when that child cannot identify a letter or a sound or a word. So that in and of itself gave us the power to say, we're not doing the right thing by these children. They're not learning to read. And partner governments said, similarly said, this is shocking. This is not right. Let's do something about this. And then the partnerships were born. And so at USAID, we released the 10-year retrospective that you spoke of, and it examines the impacts of the strategy. And from the retrospective, we found that our program, it benefited 246 million learners over 50 countries. It supports policy reform, revisions of curricula, as I mentioned, printing and distribution of countless books and reading materials, which cannot be discounted as an impact, generated actionable data to improve system performance. And the study also showed that over time, USAID programs were able to reach a larger number of students at a lower cost, with more programs demonstrating positive impact on learning outcomes. So both the early grade reading retrospective released earlier this year and this new study demonstrates USAID's early grade reading programs from this period improve learning outcomes across a variety of contexts. Importantly, USAID programs were able to achieve learning gains not only in small pilots, but at scale. And as you heard, the cost was reduced as programs were taken to scale. These are things that we like to hear. This makes us very happy in terms of our investments on USAID's side. But in addition to moving the needle on learning outcomes, there are several other key takeaways from this period. The first takeaway is that data matters. Data is what brought about this movement on improving early grade reading. EGRA's produced the data at the right time and the right level for us to work with our partner governments to say, this needs to be addressed, this is a problem, and it's impacting learning later on. So the emphasis on our early grade read programming, monitoring, and evaluation was critical. These programs did not claim to solve the problem. They were continuously monitored and evaluated and adjusted. Every EGRA became better. Every implementation fidelity became better. As we learned about what teachers need to be doing in the classroom, we adjusted, right? We thought we needed to be overly prescriptive. We didn't. We learned as we went along, and we adjusted programs. And many people online and in this room have worked with us to make those adjustments, which are not easy as you're running a massive program. But we had to in order to be successful. And then being flexible and adaptive during implementation, it drove us to collect evidence and to utilize the evidence, which is critical. And then we also learned, as you mentioned, cost effectiveness increases with scale. As programs went to scale, they became more effective. I think there's also a relationship between going to scale and the deeper engagement that you have to take with the partner ministry and with those who are implementing the program. And we need to look at that even further as we move forward with this programming. And then third, USAID structured pedagogy approach developed as a part of the partner country's curriculum includes phonics and increased the attention of evidence-based instructional practices, improved teacher training, and ongoing professional development and support. Those were paired highly with high quality teaching and learning materials to improve the outcomes and foundational skills. So all of these things had to happen together. As you saw, they didn't happen in every program, although I do have a problem with that slide and I'll talk to you later. but because I know some programs I implemented should have X's, but anyway, the combination as appropriate of these effects are what brought about the changes that we saw. Fourth, context matters. Context not only matters, it's critical. It's really hard to expect the same kind of outcomes when you're working across such complex contexts. I was mentioning earlier in Ethiopia, we did 8 languages, 15 million children out of the gate. That was the beginning. That was not a pilot, that was out of the gate. And so we were able to do that because of the willingness of the ministry at that time to engage in those languages, across those languages and across the country. And then finally, we talk about monitoring the fidelity of implementation. That became a really big issue in our later generations as we were looking at how much does fidelity actually matter? How much does it have an effect on outcomes? And although it alone, it cannot explain the variation across program results, it's necessary that the local context is looked at in terms of sustaining the results. So moving forward, we'll continue to build on the past decade of work in this area and seek to address lingering questions and challenges, such as improving learning outcomes for the most marginalized learners and mainstreaming universal design for learning in our programs. And now more than ever, there's an urgent need to prioritize reaching marginalized populations and those in vulnerable situations. The learning loss from COVID-19 has been well documented, and it's something that we are really looking at ways in which that the most vulnerable children before COVID-19 happened are even, doubly affected by some of the school shutdowns. We're looking at teaching at the right level and remediation to address post-COVID-19 learning loss and right size the interventions needed for different students and for youth that did not have a chance to develop critical foundational skills, which lead to future lifetime and academic success. And then we talked about localization. We recognize the importance of local leadership in priority setting, project design, implementation, and accountability for results. We cannot have, as I said, we couldn't have any of these results without our partnerships. We start, as Ben maybe will mention, with the curriculum of the partner country that we're working at. That is the basis what we start to look at to try to identify where some of the gaps are. Some of the biggest successful times I can remember is working out in the field. I remember in Jordan, we got a call from the ministry after years and years of advocacy with their program that they finally decided to add 45 minutes of reading a week to the curriculum. I mean, what a win to be able to change, the country's, perspective of focusing in on this. And I think they've even increased it more. These are the wins that don't get captured. These are the sustainable wins that really matter. But we don't measure for them. We don't always look at them. They can't be analyzed cleanly like you've been able to use the data set to look at. And so localization moving forward, what does that look like? And that's everybody knows that's a huge push for our agency, right? 25% of our direct local funding to local organizations moving forward, 50% of all funding being locally led. For me, in my opinion, education is always locally led. We work with the biggest numbers of the civil service in every country we work in, the teachers. We work across governments, we work across regions. Local leadership is critical to the success of any program that we'd like to implement in partnership with governments, but we do want to be even more intentional. We're developing indicators that really look at measuring this so that we can track over time what our local investments are. We are working with implementing partners to have them, shift some of the leadership over time or originally so that they can work with local partners in order to implement education programs. But all this is to say, this has been happening forever in the education sector, but we're going to be much more intentional about measuring it and reporting on it so that folks can really understand the big picture and the true picture of what we're doing. So I'd like to just conclude my remarks by expressing my gratitude to all the partners who contributed to this effort over many years. It's a labor of love for many of us, and the partners that we worked in throughout government, the curriculum, the planning departments, the ministers, the deputy ministers that have really engaged and been with us in all of these efforts to really move the needle on early grade foundational skills, to work with first graders, second graders, and third graders, to convince their countries that we need more testing. I mean, in Jordan, that was the last thing people wanted, was more testing. But again, it was the right kind of testing at the right age that we can actually move a needle on and make a difference. So, and then just finally, some of our shared achievements. Again, as partners, we increase the focus on improving the quality of schooling in the early grades. This effort is still ongoing. We generated data that provides insight into student learning. We grew the evidence base for effective approaches to literacy, especially in multilingual contexts. We promoted equity in learning, particularly for the most marginalized. We advanced policies that support children's learning and to read in a language that they actually understand. And we partnered with governments to adopt materials, approaches, and systems to enhance student reading performance and increase sustainability. So thank you for this opportunity to speak about our work. And now I will hand it over to our technical friend, Ben, to get into some of the deeper stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, so we're happy to go to Ben now. And I have to imagine you will speak to your own experience directly working on these programs and leading some of the more successful ones, and hopefully you can share some of why you think those were so successful. Thanks. Go ahead, Ben.
And hi, everybody. Good to see friends in the room and online. So my name is Ben Piper, Director for Global Education at the Gates Foundation. As you know, improving learning is the core of our strategy. Since this call started, I got a report from yet another country with dramatically lower results on testing this year. This issue remains and one we need to continue to solve. I've lived in Africa for the duration of the timeline that these results account for, focused on these things. So sadly, you think about some of the mistakes that I made, that resulted in smaller impacts than we would have wanted. So I actually want to share my remarks in 4 questions. So here's my first question. Number 1, what does 3 correct words per minute mean practically? Between Justin and Allison, we've talked about hundreds of millions of kids in dozens of countries. But what does it actually mean if we had to boil it down? On the one hand, I wrote a paper back in the day that's about large effect sizes and small progress on learning. There is an organization called the Center for Global Development that recently published a paper on effect sizes. And I just reread that paper on effect sizes, and this average 0.3 standard deviation effect would be somewhere between the 80th and 90th percentile of education outcomes globally. That's the average effect. So on the one hand, the magnitude of effects, just from effect size point of view, seems small, but in the broad range of international research, they are quite large. And that, again, masks some of the variation. And I think figure 9 of the paper also talks about, on average, that these results are half a year of additional schooling. So from a social science point of view, and actually that paper I wrote showed that those effects are twice as big as they are in the US in much smaller studies. So on the one hand, they're meaningful, and the other hand, they're just not nearly large enough to get kids to where they need to be. Because if you think about where the average kid is in most of these countries, we just are not there. And whether it's 3 or even if it was 6 or 8, that's just not there. It's just not good enough. So for the implementers in the room, for the researchers in the room, for the donor partners like me in the room, what is needed from our end to get outcomes substantially higher? And I feel like that's the main takeaway for this research. And I have some thoughts on this, but I think fundamentally, if we start from the point of view that these results suggest that, yes, meaningful impacts, social science would be excited, researchers and universities would be pumped by this. But for me, being on the ground for the last, I don't even know, many years in this continent, it's really a problem. Actually, one small thing, Justin, you talked about in this version is the kind of summer loss average of 10 correct words per minute. There was a previous paper that we had that looked at that from Malawi, but if that's the average aggregate evidence, it points to a real issue. And I think your results, Justin and team, show that the magnitude of loss is bigger for younger kids. It points to the importance of being effective in improving learning early so that kids crack the code and those skills are less likely to atrophy. So when I hear the question, what does 3 correct words per minute improvement mean? It's not big enough at all, but there is some progress. Number 2, second question, what should we do differently? Fundamentally, what do we need to do to improve learning outcomes at scale? That is my waking, sleeping question. I think one comment is, let's do less extraneous stuff. So lots of USAID programs that we used to fund have elements that were not as focused on instructional improvement. And my main point is that the best way to improve learning is to improve teaching. And the best way to improve teaching is to help teachers teach better. Very simple. But I think so much of our investments sometimes are on things that are quite far afield from that question. Implementation research would suggest that we need to pivot faster, or the lack of implementation research would suggest we need to pivot faster when programs aren't working. I have seen programs that struggle in year 1 and struggle in year 2 and struggle in year 3 and don't pivot fast enough to improve outcomes. So to the authors, there's a section on there about the fidelity of implementation data that does exist and that didn't explain the outcomes, but also says that the availability of that evidence isn't regular. At least within one implementer I know of, an unpublished study suggested the implementation failure actually mattered quite a bit to average effects. And that's not just across programs, that's within programs. You saw the Tusome results there that have decent impacts, but these results are from the end line. And at the end line, it was after a decision was made to reduce the number of days where the program was used from 5 days a week to 3 days a week. So if you include the midterm results when you were doing Tusome 5 days a week, you were getting 20 words per minute increases in English and 12 or 13 in Kiswahili. It's just one program, but I think it's an example of how implementation does matter. You can have more than double the gains when implementation is much more frequent. Implementation, every teacher, every day. What should we do differently? That, to me, is a key part of it. How do we organize our programs or organize our funding for the donors in the room to make sure that that is happening. And also they were measuring data so that the next time CGD or others are looking at implementation of fidelity data, we have some that's comparable and usable. Third question, what do I think Justin and the authors should change in the paper?
Now we get into it.
Now we're into it. So I think the study needs to account not just for bilingual programs, not just to compare whether or not program effects are bigger in L1 or L2, but also to consider how programs that are bilingual are different than programs that are monolingual. So impact of a bilingual program here is estimated as 3, but shouldn't it be 3 and 3? So it's the two different languages. And I think even though you don't probably have that data available, we as researchers need to think about what do the modules suggest about language transfer? And how do the second language included in the program provide some additive impacts that might make the program actually easier to stomach, easier to implement, because teachers in most of these countries are already teaching these 2 languages. And shouldn't fundamentally the sector get better at this kind of research and design? I also think that I don't really buy the lack of comparison of ORF. I know, Justin, in this version, you added the letter correct per minute, but I think, at least in some analyses I've done in the past, the relationship between letters and ORF is not always linear. You show that in the paper, but I think there's another way you can look at this, which is within the ORF, being able to pull out the words and break those down by syllables within programs. I'm gonna go off video given my internet challenges. And I think just some of the paper is just still depending on a comparison between local language and second language results that doesn't account for these differences, which are fundamental. You saw that. You have that quote from Helen Abadzi and Matthew Jukes and others that have looked into this in the past. I think that's a doable analysis that the paper would benefit from. And I think also on the cost side, I think as you mentioned, or maybe Allison mentioned, there are different sorts of programs at different stages. So cost that just throws it into one model doesn't account for some of these that are just pilots versus those that are scale. And that said, I think the researchers and implementers in the room need to make sure when we're doing programming for scaling, even if it's the efficacy trial, we should design for scale and make sure that the costs at the student level and school level are sustainable. And I think also the USAID programs are doing a lot, and not only those interventions, all of those programs are kind of related to, or fundamentally related to learning improvement. I'll put in the chat in a moment a new literacy at scale study that does some deeper cost analysis, because I think it's a critical thing that the sector needs to do better on, and that we at the kind of nexus between research, funding, and implementation need to have at the forefront of our thinking as we design. And the final push is that you should cite the other CGD papers on effect sizes. I think that's an important nuance on where things fall. And the last question I had, this one's gonna be a bit of a briefer answer. What do we need to do with the implications of this paper on the location of partners, on the localization agenda? My answer to that is pretty simple. If we want to have more local partners implementing, we need to have more local partners implementing. And that is just the task for us as a partner, a donor, and for those of you in the room. The only way to do it is to do it. So that's a short answer. So I want to close with just the last couple comments. Hopefully my internet's doing better. I think this is fundamentally an important study. And as others have said, USAID is unique in that they made this data available. We actually need more of this from others who are doing this kind of work. Thanks to CGD for doing this analysis and all of the partners who worked hard on these issues. If you hear anything from me, we need to improve as a sector on the implementation of literacy programs. What's it gonna take to do better? What's it gonna take to fund better? How should we start thinking about incorporating numeracy as well? That's a big push from us. What should we do to consider bilingual interventions from the outset so you're getting some additive effects? You're thinking about language transfer. The task is on implementers to learn from this work and to better measure fidelity of implementation. I think that is a core part of our work as a sector that the CGD paper was not able to analyze, but is important. How do we understand whether or not the programs are being implemented as intended? If not, how do we shift from that? This on us as partners, design interventions that improve outcomes. The paper shows that the average program increases learning by almost half a year of school, which is a good start, but given how little kids learn in the school normally, it's definitely not good enough. So looking forward to the rest of the conversation, and thanks for the chance to talk about this paper.
Great, thank you so much. I had a few questions, but to be honest, I think Alison, Ben, you were very thorough and covered most of them, and we've got a good crowd, both solid crowd in person for the Monday before Thanksgiving, but also quite a crowd online. So I think we'll just go ahead and turn to a sort of open question and answer period. So if you're here in person, you can just sort of raise your hand. I would just ask, there's a little button that looks like someone talking on the right side of your microphone. And if you could press that when you speak, then everyone online will be able to hear you. And if you're online, you can feel free to use the little reaction button to raise your hand. We also have a Q&A sort of section there. So if you feel more comfortable typing your question and I can read them, that works too. And if you can let us know when you do speak, your name and where you're affiliated, that would be great. So maybe we'll see if we have any questions in the room first, and then we'll go online.
I'm Michael Crawford from the World Bank. I've been involved in learning poverty, foundational literacy, and the accelerator program, which is generously supported by Gates Foundation and others. First of all, thanks to CGD. This is really super, and along with the dedication to evaluation from USAID, this is tremendously helpful for a big agenda and a great step forward, and going to be very useful. Thanks to USAID, it is not an exaggeration to say without this decade commitment, there's no way that the World Bank embraces foundational learning in the way that it, without the example of these amazing accomplishments. And that said, I think that there are, it's really true that these are great gains and they're not nearly enough. So if you indulge me, I'd like to just make a small comparison with my own feeble efforts to learn to play piano. If we suggest chords per minute instead of words per minute, I'm probably, after 18 months, I probably improve at about 3 chords per minute, but it's simply not music unless you get to a certain number. You know, the timing matters. And I think this is really true for reading. And so I have 2 kind of comments, which are, I guess, could be put in form of the statement. I feel Ben says, what should we do differently? I want to ask whether increasing the understanding of the end goal, whether we've done enough of that. What does it actually look like to be a reader? You know, to go from learning to read to reading to learn. How many words per minute? There are a huge number of technical issues of doing this, even in one language, but the advantage could be, you know, just last week I was in the Republic of the Congo. Nobody really understands clearly where we're trying to get to, because we haven't been able to articulate, I think, clearly enough. So maybe the question is, do you agree? I think I love the other research, which I think from CGD, about the gap between policymakers' beliefs about success. And that's really, really, I find that really, really influencing the day-to-day. So the first thing is, can we do more to say what success looks like for readers in a way that's going to help? The second thing, which is, like my efforts with piano, there's just not enough time. I'm just not spending enough time. The reason I'm not making progress is you need to do an hour a day, and I'm not even doing an hour a week, and there's just no way to progress. And so I think, and you know, if I wanted sort of the bilingual aspect, if I wanted to both play piano and sing, which I eventually do, you know, at the same time, I'd probably need 2 hours a day to get both of those skills. So just really, I think this is hugely important to document significant progress. But I feel like because people don't most clearly have an idea of what success looks like, and we are systematically neglecting the amount of time that it takes to get kids there. So to make those questions, I'd love to hear in discussion what people think on these topics.
Thank you. And we hope to come to your concert in the near future. So please invite us. Look, I think Ben will agree with me. The goal is comprehension. The goal of children learning to read is that they comprehend, that they understand what they're reading. and then they can read to learn for the rest of their lives. How you get there has been our struggle, right? How do you get to that level of comprehension? You break it down and you go backwards and you look at letters and sounds and all the good things. We have focused a lot on trying to make some measurement towards comprehension for sure. And I know in each country in which we work, there is that number of words per minute that you're aiming to get, that can get you the level of comprehension that you need for a child to actually remember what they're reading. So that is the goal, and we are not there, and we need to work harder to get there. As Ben said, we've figured out, I think, a lot of what it takes to move the needle, but it's not there on comprehension.
Hi, thanks so much for this initiative. I'm Jennifer Swift-Morgan from Phonics International. A couple of thoughts and actually some responses to you too, Michael. In terms of what we're trying to achieve, I think that there are a lot of colleagues online and others who have worked on the Global Proficiency Framework to actually start defining what a good reader looks like and to do policy linking for each country in each context. What does a good reader look like? So I do think that we are making progress as a community around that. And I wanted to go back to something fundamental, even in the title of this event, in terms of phonics and foreign aid. I do think implementation is important. I and many of my colleagues, teammates around the world, have literally spent blood, sweat, and tears working on implementation and the details of the day-to-day of what it looks like for a teacher to get this done. So 100%, we've been working on fidelity of implementation measures. All of that matters. We've seen some new recent papers on TARL and different specifics in the nitty-gritty of implementation. So yes, 100%. However, getting back to phonics, I have looked at a number of these materials, right? Our own and with our partners around the world, others. Not all of these programs are using phonics. And not all of these programs and materials are designed to have those teachers succeed. And this is a point that I've brought up a few times. Yes, we need to work with teachers, but if the core curriculum and the core teaching and learning materials do not follow the science of reading, and I don't mean structured pedagogy is part of it, but what are you structuring? There are too many of our programmings around the world and our materials that are simply not setting kids up and teachers up for success in the classroom with the kind of text and the amount of text you need to crack the code and achieve mastery, skill by skill by skill. Otherwise, if you skip something, you're not going to succeed. So yes, implementation, yes, let's work with teachers, but if we don't have those core fundamentals correct, we are going to set them up for failure, both the teachers and the middle tier leaders within ministry and within national organizations that are trying to get this done. So yes, let's look at that. But I think we need to look under the hood a lot more deeply to make sure that what we're actually distributing is going to work. Thanks.
Any other questions in the room? Otherwise, we can go to Alejandro online. Alejandro.
Thank you. My name is Alejandro Ome. I'm from Norcat University of Chicago. I've worked in some of these studies, so it's very interesting to see this compilation. Thank you very much. As I work on these studies, there's a question that has haunted me a little bit. What do we know about the long-term impacts of these programs? I think, especially in the context where we find small impacts, the long-term impacts might be very important to document, because it could be that actually very small differences, it's human capital, so they accumulate and it's bigger a few years later, or maybe not. Maybe all kids learn how to read eventually, and there's no more to. I mean, the impacts are small, and in the long term negligible. I think there's been 10 years that we've been doing this, so there's probably opportunities to further that research agenda some of these countries have administrative data that could be used for that. But yeah, just trying to see if, in a way, I'm trying to see if this is a line of research that is interesting, but also to see what people know about this topic. I think it would be very interesting. Thank you.
I want to jump in quickly there, Alejandro. I think, and I'm curious to hear if Allison and others can point to more collectively around the table what people know that's going on. But here at CGD, we do have a small initiative that we've started up, trying to look at one aspect of sustainability and long-run impacts of these programs and kind of foundational literacy programs in general, which is to go back up to a decade later to students who were involved in randomized trials of early grade reading and foundational literacy interventions and to track them. And so we've been talking to some of your USAID colleagues about accessing, old pupil rosters and things. And so we're trying to do that in 4 countries just at a pilot stage right now. But I think there's 2 kind of different notions of long run impact and sustainability that this is fairly obvious, but just to point it out, we're focused there on like, if you get, an additional 10 correct words per minute in grade 2, what does that buy you in terms of hopefully increased transition to secondary school, hopefully increased lifetime earnings and health? And, we want to measure those things in an experimental way. The other aspect of sustainability, which in some ways is easier to look at, it would also be, I wonder if what data sets exist, is just at the school level, when these programs go away, since many of these were randomized trials, and you do have, control schools, when these programs go away, how much of this, pedagogical practice, endures and lasts in these schools. Methodologically, I think that should be fairly simple to pick up, and I haven't seen a lot on that, so would be eager to read more and encourage others to join us, and maybe we can find ways to do more of that.
Thank you.
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think the best example that I know of is in the early grade reading study from South Africa, which was done by the Department of Ed in South Africa. And it shows there was 2 treatment groups in the initial stages. It shows long-run effects over 7 years, where the coaching program, not just the materials and training program, but materials, training, and coaching, the effects sustained through grade 7. It is a clear need from a research point of view for more long-run estimates, because it's not just do the effects sustain, but if you had long-run data, you could do proper path analysis, structural equation modeling, and understand for those kids who hit Michael's piano benchmark, what were their skill levels at the beginning of grade 1, and make sure you design grade 1, grade 2 around what skills they have to get to be able to be where they need to be at the end of grade 7. So I'll put, this is not the full paper, it's just one I found just now on this early grade reading study. And it's really important one to keep track of. Over.
Thanks, Ben. Just from USAID's perspective, to address that question of sustainability, I think moving forward, you're going to see a lot more of a model of technical assistance provided directly to governments. And we have that in certain countries right now. And since 2018, government-to-government funding, USAID to partner governments, has been provided in 8 countries for basic education, with a total of, through 20 different awards, totaling $166 million in obligations. So the idea of providing more direct support to governments is something that the next phase of USAID education programming is going to be pushing, and it does align to our administrators' push for localization quite closely. Our study found that USAID programs, not surprisingly, that built on existing government initiatives and policy shifts resulted in more sustainable change. So kind of, Jennifer, what you were mentioning, looking at not just programs, because we don't want to sustain programs, we want to sustain government systems, right? So looking at those systems that are going to set teachers up and students up for success, and then putting funding and resources behind those efforts is the next phase moving forward. And also to provide teaching and materials that are more relevant, effective, and sustainable. To do that, they need to be local materials. We can't take one set of materials from one place and think that they're going to apply to another. We know this, but it does happen, unfortunately, in some of our programming. So again, the point is not to sustain programs, the point is to sustain results. And that's the approach that we're looking at moving forward. Again, and it's directly in line with what we'll be measuring at USAID, 50% of all funding being locally led, 25% of funding direct local organizations. But we really can't do that without our partners that are here in this room and online. It's a partnership, and we don't have the capacity staff-wise to be doing this work and bringing experts. We also want to look at more local experts, of course, and utilize the expertise that already exists in country. But we will continue to do it in partnership.
Great. We'll go to Steve Cleese online.
Thank you. Wonderful that we're having this discussion. 3 quick comments, questions. One for Justin, that your conclusions that later programs had more impact, was that statistically significant? Second, I think it's a misnomer to call what you did a cost effectiveness analysis. USAID expenditures have nothing to do with the program cost analysis, which is very different. It would include teacher time, local materials, etc. And lastly, that has been said before, 3 more correct words per minute for billions of dollars, when the goal is 60 correct words per minute, even if you accept that as a useful outcome, just seems like such low returns for your money, when we know that it is not hard to teach literacy, to teach reading. If we had a small class size, trained teachers, and students who didn't come to the classroom hungry, we're missing the big picture on this. We're working within givens of large classes, not well-trained teachers, students who are living in poverty. We need to look at that big picture to change this. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. So I can answer some of those, and I can't answer all of them. Is the increase over time in program effectiveness statistically significant? Yes and no. It is statistically significant for the ORF, for the correct words per minute. It isn't actually on correct letter sounds per minute. So we didn't lean super hard on that. But there is a significant increase for correct words. I mean, I think that's important that it establishes, a learning trajectory and an upward trajectory. If you look post 2013, the effects move up from 2.9 overall to 3.2 overall. I mean, it's not a dramatic sea change in effectiveness. Is this really cost effectiveness analysis? For sure, where we're ignoring complementary costs that come from. I think it's in the vein of comparative cost effectiveness analysis. We're comparing alternative program modalities and what is the kind of fiscal cost to the US in foreign aid. It's not kind of old school cost benefit analysis where we put a cost on every input of the teacher's time and the rental cost of the school building and that, kind of thing. I agree that would be, and that kind of thing would say, is it economically justified to educate kids? Is not a question that I'm tackling here. I'm kind of taking for granted that we want to increase literacy and what's the most cost-effective way that we can do that. I'm kind of with you on it's very subjective. I do find 3 words per minute is daunting. I'm not sure I agree that it's easy. I don't think it's easy to do a lot better. I'm all for feeding kids, and I think that helps. But this stuff isn't easy, as I think a lot of people in the room can attest. Well, let me stop there. Maybe others want to come in.
Ben, did you have want to weigh in at all?
No, I'm good.
All right.
Hi, this is Daniel Levan. I'm in the room here. I'm the director of Merle at Education Development Center. I mean, I think I agree with Dr. Cleese that this is extremely salutary. I'm just absolutely delighted that this paper was presented here and that we're having this conversation. When he said, it's easy to teach kids to read, and I heard some chuckles in the room here. Like, I do agree with that, and I've had this conversation with Peggy that we know how to do it, and Jennifer here just said the scientific way to do it is well established, and we know how to do it, and we can train a teacher to do it. But what we can't do is train thousands of teachers in the kind of contexts, working in the kinds of conditions that Dr. Cleese was mentioning. That's where we don't know how to do it, and so I think the talk of fidelity of implementation isn't sufficient to get at fidelity to, if that fidelity is only to a design and to a paradigm of design that doesn't have enough dosage for what is required for the teacher to make that kind of change. We know already from developed context, from literature from the 70s, 80s, 90s, what teachers need to make a real change to their practice. They need to be immersed in it. They need ongoing coaching. They need a lot of ongoing support. And the kinds of projects that we do here in this don't really meet that standard. And I think it's clear that, I mean, what we need more than just looking at how faithfully is the design implemented is thorough research on the whole theory of change behind that design and all the causal steps in it. Like, we don't have good enough classroom observation that really, digs at the quality of what teachers are doing and how well they're really absorbing what would be required to get kids to read. And the issue, also around cost and scale. If as I completely agree with what Alison was saying, we need to move towards getting things that can be institutionalized and run by state systems. That there's the evidence of what was accomplished when an implementing partner was resource intensively implementing this really doesn't, we can't make any assumptions about what would happen when the state takes it over. Nor would the resources and the cost of it be equivalent to what was spent by the project.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, that said, when we say we know how to teach a child how to read, we know what's needed, that's almost irrelevant because it's not us doing it, right? It's the partner countries that we work in. So how do we partner so that those leaders have what it takes, the necessary inputs, support, to be able to sustain teaching their children to read, within their system, as opposed to, how can we help maybe move the needle in a period of time? It's how can we actually help that system develop? It's a systems approach that we all need to wrap our heads more around. And it's a little bit more difficult to think about doing that than it is to think about actually having these EGRAs that we're running with their support, but we're really the lead. I think we need to really start thinking about that shift now that we have evidence and the countries that we work with have evidence as to what works. So how do we now invest in their systems? That's the key. Thanks.
We're going to go to Marcia Davidson online.
Thank you. I have a question, well, a couple of questions. One is looking at the learning trajectories and trying to sort of predict what it would take to become literate if we're finding the early primary grades generally improving by about 3 correct words per minute. I think that's been addressed to some extent, but I'm thinking about the need for upper primary and secondary kinds of interventions or continued support for reading acquisition, that perhaps that increase isn't going to be sufficient to allow for sort of the self-teaching necessary to build reading proficiency. But my next comment sort of question has to do with what it takes to teach reading from a teacher's perspective. And I wanted to start with I always have to remind myself that automaticity is a double-edged sword. And what we find is that we're working with teachers and they're just hearing us talk about what engaged instruction is and how to do it. I mean, I've seen teachers take great lesson plans and teach them as chalk and talk because they're always going to revert to what's familiar in the end. And if you're going to, yes, we know how to effectively teach children to read, but that requires behavior change that teachers need to see, they need to feel, and they need to practice. It isn't something that they're going to hear about and be able to make those changes because they often have never seen it. And I think that's one of the reasons why teaching at the right level has been so effective, is that pedagogy is an experienced one. And I think when we look at the most marginalized schools and classrooms and the teachers of those schools, if they're teaching effectively, then we have sort of a way forward. But I just wanted to ask, what others are finding in their that process of looking at effective teaching pedagogy and how to get there, because it isn't just providing the resources, it's actually experiencing, practicing, and building to a new level of automaticity, that kind of engaged and effective set of teaching behaviors. Thanks.
I'm guessing somebody in the room is going to do a better job than me than talking about how many. Peggy, why don't you tell us how many words per minute it takes to be a fluent reader?
That's a minefield of a question, but I mean, generally, sorry, sort of a minefield of a question. But I mean, generally, you want children to be reading in meaningful phrases. And so, depending on the length of the words, usually, about a word a second is a pretty good thing you'd want children to be able to do after a few years of schooling. Yeah, I think what Marcia was just saying, though, is kind of building on what you were saying earlier about teachers in DRC haven't, needing an example of where we're trying to get towards. And so, this idea of teachers, they, as Marcia just said, they do the chalk and talk, they do the traditional methods that they know because that's what they were taught as children or as young people. And so, what does that look like? And I'm imagining video banks of that USAID has that could be made available for teachers in the region, to look at each other's of what's effective. Yeah, I don't really have any comments to add, but other than just I'm interested in the data. If I could ask a question about, is there anything in the data sets that allows you to look at class size and to look at the difference between, something between 20 and 50 children per classroom, and once they get over 70 children, because I do think that is that does become one of the, I think, barriers in some places.
You probably know better than me again, but that's a very good. I haven't done that. Haven't even tried. I think that is a very good suggestion in terms of what things can we actually measure in terms of contextual factors at the school level that could start to explain variation. We've been trying to look a little bit at are effects bigger or smaller in schools that began at higher or lower levels and things like that. But I think this class size, I assume the thought that's in your head, and many people have articulated before that it's very hard to make that transition away from chalk and talk if you have such large class sizes. That maybe if we conditioned on smaller class sizes, that might be a kind of insufficient but necessary characteristic of a school for these treatment effects to be bigger. I will look.
All right, great.
Preston, can I jump in on that? Not having published this, I want to say this next sentence carefully, but most of the regressions I've run where you put in class size as a predictor, larger classes, I have better outcomes, which is purely counterintuitive, but it's because of the urbanicity overlaps with class size, right? So it's larger schools in urban areas often are associated with better outcomes. So it's quite hard to tease out the relationship between class size and urbanicity, at least in the analyses I've done. So I don't think I can think of many data sets where even controlling for urbanicity, these are crude measures, you find a very strong relationship between class size and outcomes, which means to me that there are definitely some large classes, there's a number at which this sentence is no longer valid. And I'm not sure if it's 70 or 80, but there's some number is no longer valid. But there are some schools, some classrooms, some teachers who are doing a decent job with the large classes. And I think it's really dangerous to say, and that's not what anybody in the room is saying, or Stevens is saying this, I don't think. Let's not wait, I'm here in Ethiopia. Let's not wait for the class sizes of 60 to come down to 30 before we start teaching them to read, because that's going to take a long time given the number of teachers that are needed in these countries. But let's help teachers in 2024, 2023 in the context that they currently have. Thanks.
Okay, just a quick question on the methodology and the data that you were looking at. You noted that studies that didn't have RCT or diff-diff had the pre-post showed slower progress. My immediate thought was those, in our case personally, when we didn't use RCTs because there was no counterfactual because we were already at scale. So I wondered if you went back and looked at that. The studies for which there's an RCT means there's some place in the country that's not using that treatment. And like in Allison's case, where you're at like huge scale from the very beginning, you don't have that ability. There is no counterfactual. So be curious. So meaning if it's smaller, right, such that you have the counterfactual, that could be part of the factor because you're looking at things that are already smaller scale. So it'd be interesting to tease that out and see if you're seeing those differences between those data sets. Thanks.
Just make sure I'm clear on what you're saying. So I think it's definitely the case that bigger programs are more likely to get a before and after evaluation, right? At some extent, okay, the biggest programs can't have an RCT, as you just described. And as we said in the presentation, I mean, there is some, but not significant tendency for those bigger programs to seem to show weaker impacts and slower gains. But I think, just to make sure I'm hearing you right, I mean, I guess there is the possibility that a nationwide program could have already been preceded by another nationwide program so that the baseline was contaminated. I mean, I can imagine that being the case, hypothetically.
That's another good point. It's not the point I was making,
Okay.
but that's another good thing to know. I was just suggesting that simply it's another scale factor. And there could be historic, I mean, part of the issue with the cost comparisons, and I think probably the paper that Ben was referring to, one of the papers, many that we all have to go back and do all the reading that Ben's been doing, but I believe he was referring to the learning at scale paper that was just released on time and money, which goes into some deeper factors, which would scratch some of Steve's itches too. I think there's a lot of space in between what you were calling old school cost benefit analysis and still a fair more amount of precision that we can get to with cost. No, but I was really just talking about scale. So were the programs for which there were RCTs, were they showing better progress because they're smaller? Or even at earlier stages where you can get greater gains. Another point is reform stage, something we've been talking about a little bit more too, right? And that's a cost factor too. Where are you in the history of reform? It's been, right, we just had the decade retrospective, but there were pilots well before then. Countries are all across the map in terms of where they have been in their own reforms around early grade reading. So how does that factor into all of this as well? Thanks.
The short answer to your question is yes. I'm just looking here. You know, before and after studies on average have about twice as many kids, beneficiaries. That's not as big a difference as I actually expected. The RCTs and the diff and diffs are very similar in terms of the number of total pupils treated, but the before and after studies are bigger programs. I want to come back on this cost point though, because it goes back to one of the first things that Ben said. And I just want to be, the difficult, external person here and say, or put a provocative, thesis on the table, which is I'm an experimentalist kind of by training, and that if I want to know how a program works, I want to see us go out and try it and see how it works, and not model it and see how we think it should work, right? And I take the same approach on the cost side. If I want to know what we can do for $100, I want us to go do it for $100, right? And I feel like a lot of the more sophisticated cost work that gets done, to be really uncharitable here, amounts to sophisticated ways of hiding my costs and saying like, well, that doesn't count because that wasn't core to the activity. That workshop, that wasn't about the program, that's a workshop we just had. Well, okay, if you think you can do it for 20 bucks, then let's go do it for 20 bucks. But right now, it costs you $200 per pupil on average in the programs. And I think that's the money that US taxpayers are going to have to spend. That's the money the World Bank's going to have to put in. And so I think those top line cost numbers really hold our feet to the fire a little bit. Now, we need to do research on cost and understand where those costs are coming from and model the costs, because the top line number doesn't help you on a day-to-day basis much, but for an accountability purpose, I still am drawn to that top line number.
All right, well, I didn't know we were going to go down this methodological rabbit hole, but we have one more hand up online that we haven't gone to. So I want to turn it over to Connor and then want to give Allison and Ben a chance, sort of last chance here to jump in and respond either to his question or anything else we've discussed today.
Okay, hi, can everybody hear? I'm trying to put video on, if anybody can see me. My name's Connor O'Byrne. I'm a literacy practitioner out in Zimbabwe, and we also work in Zambia and Malawi. So this is a very interesting presentation and forum to listen to. One perhaps small suggestion talking about the cost. One of the measures that we find very useful is not so much cost per child, and I would like to hear whether USAID and bigger organizations will start using this. You should do a cost per child per point gain in fluency. Now that will give you an idea of the overall cost, and B, how effective it is. Because if you only produce 3 words per minute increase at having spent a lot of money, that figure will be very high. And if you achieve a much bigger presentation, almost no matter what you've spent, that figure will be dramatically lower. I mean, for example, I can give you an example of what is practical and possible to do, and we've replicated this a number of times. In a situation in Malawi, we read the reports of one of the big programs there, yes, funded by USAID, and the consultants who wrote it said it would cost $140 per child to achieve a 1-point increase in fluency. And they again were getting very, very small increases in fluency, literally from, I think it was 14.9 to 15.1. So that made it very, very expensive. And I can tell you that we have achieved increases in fluency, doubling it from 12 to 30, more than doubling it. And for the kids that went past the first stage of our program, they got up to 48 to 55. Which is below that bare minimum of 45. So it is possible to do it. And we achieved this in a class of 284 children in one class with one teacher and one session. And we replicated it again with another pilot with a bunch of other schools. So it is possible to address the problem, given all the situations of the teachers who were not well trained, large classes, poor rural environments, etc., etc. It is possible. But if we use that measure of cost, of total project cost, divided by the number of children, divided by the number of CWPM increase points, you then get a very, very effective measure as to how effective the program is. And I actually calculated the figure for our project, and it came to 9 cents, as opposed to $140. So I'm trying to say, as a practitioner, doing this in Africa in the same difficult rural environments that we're all talking about in all 3 countries, it is possible to solve the problem, but we do need to look at how we measure it for true cost effectiveness, not cost per beneficiary, but cost per effectiveness. And then look at the whole discussions about how you do it. But that was the point I mainly wanted to make.
Great, thank you, Connor. And Allison, Ben.
Yeah, I can chime in for some last thoughts. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for this really interesting conversation. I don't want any of us to come away from this morning thinking only 3 words per minute. I don't think that's accurate as and only, as Ben said, because it is a significant increase in change, but it's also an average. So there are many countries that did much, much more than this, and many that didn't get to 3. So there's a lot to unpack on that. So I don't think we need to, leave here and say, oh, USAID in 10 years only increased 3 words per minute, because that would just kind of discount much of our work. I also do think when we think about cost of programs, I think we need to start thinking beyond programs. USAID has an initiative called Progress Beyond Programs. Programs are not the be all and end all. What we are meant to do is improve systems and transform education systems with our funding and basic education funds. So we, as USAID, need to think very thoughtfully with all of our partners on what is the best investment for our funds. And is it programs or is it systems? And so that's where we'll be diving deeper using this evidence that we've created over the past decade together with you all. And that is the next generation of what we need to be looking at in terms of effective foreign aid. Thanks.
Ben, do you want to chime in?
Yes, please. Trying to turn my video back on. But okay, so I would say a few things. Number one, I'm leaving this excited to do something better by the things I've heard. So I want to call some people out. Jennifer, we have better phonics in the materials. Marcia tells us we need to have a better understanding of the prevailing instruction. Allison is pushing for more local partners. Peggy and Michael are asking us to think about the benchmarks, not the averages. And the one thing Ben wants you to think about is how you design for scale from the outset, from a cost perspective, so that we are designing inexpensive but potentially highly effective programs from the beginning and not trying to design after we pilot. So I'm not sure what you're taking away, but I'm taking away something to make me do better, because fundamentally the task ahead is to do better on this, and to do better on this as we incorporate the second language, as we incorporate numeracy, but to build on the work that USAID has led us on for this decade. Thanks to the team.
Thanks, Ben. And Justin, final word. Sorry, I'm a bad timekeeper here.
No, very brief. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And it's a real privilege to have such a experienced and knowledgeable group around the table talking to each other. I do, want to half disagree and half emphatically agree with what, something Allison said. And I do think 3 words a minute, I'm not going to be shy, is challenging and should leave us a little bit uncomfortable. But I also want to say that I really want us not to conceive of this as there is one thing, it's called early grade reading programs, and they generated 3 words a minute, and now we know the answer, and put it in that bucket or that box. So the whole point of this evaluation portfolio is many different programs, many different contexts, evolving over time, learning from those evaluations, continually trying to improve. And this whole conversation is not just a retrospective, but I hope is the kind of ongoing, iterative improvement that you guys are all is your bread and butter. So thanks for letting me join the conversation. Thanks for coming.
Great. Thanks, everyone.